Did you hear? We're almost there. You ready to grab this new world by the horns?
Quality of Life is the name of the game with Monster Hunter World. Actually, this is patently false, since Monster Hunter World is in fact the name of the game, but regardless, quality of life improvements were clearly Capcom's primary interest for the latest entry in its long-running action RPG series. Monster Hunter, at its core, has always been a series of action-heavy games centered around boss fights with the monsters that inhabit its lands. Released nearly 14 years after the first Monster Hunter title on PlayStation 2, Monster Hunter World marks the first time in as many years that American fans can play a game in the series on the latest console hardware. Previously, most entries in the series were relegated to the handheld space, severely limiting the possibilities of their performance. This meant that while the hardware improvements brought on by the succession of the PlayStation 2 and Xbox by the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 meant games overall could get bigger in scope, for years Monster Hunter as a series was largely shackled in its ambition and forced to resemble the first entry in its series for years. Monster Hunter World preserves the core gameplay loop of the series. Pick from a large selection of melee and long-range weapons, track a large monster using footprints, feathers, and other droppings, kill that large monster and steal its credit cards, use that monster's innards and hide for new weapons and armor, and use that new gear to aid you in killing other monsters. Rinse and repeat, all the while accruing new gear with different strengths and weaknesses, which have varying degrees of effectiveness depending on the monster a player uses them on. The high commitment to combat animations and high player damage make Dark Souls the closest analog to this game in terms of how it feels to play, but Monster Hunter's gameplay loop and reason to keep playing is its loot system, a constant stream of upgrades requiring ever more monster parts to create. This loop is much less Dark Souls and much more Diablo or Borderlands. The game's loot and crafting can be annoying at times, since players will often come back from slaying the proboscis nose snot monster only to question whether they should use its nose skin to craft a snot rag, or perhaps wait and see if the weapons tree will open up and let you craft a snot rocket with the same loot. This is simply a consequence of a loot system though, and I'd much rather have it than not. The game's series of monster hunts is vaguely justified by its story, but in true Monster Hunter fashion, the story is thin, unengaging, and tremendously formulaic. The real stories that come from playing Monster Hunter games are not scripted at all, but instead come from its systems-driven gameplay. The stories that players will end up gushing to their friends over will inevitably emerge from the gameplay, times where two different monsters get into a turf war, or a monster gets into a position to allow it to be damaged by the environment, or players are able to utilize the environment to their advantage, like jumping from a high ledge onto a monster to knock it to the ground. On a macro level, Monster Hunter World's story is weak, but the game's strength comes in the possibility for players to experience a unique, personal, small-scale story in each mission. All the ground that Monster Hunter World loses with its story, it makes up for with charm and character. The world you inhabit, Astera, feels vibrant and jubilant. Returning there from a hunt fills me with a sense of excitement since it means I might get to craft a new weapon and watch the animation of the smithy's workers gleefully craft it. It also means I'll be eating at the canteen before my next hunt, which is accompanied by a cutscene of cat chefs preparing my meal with contagious gusto. This charm continues out into the field, where drinking a potion while running gives your character a Jack Sparrow-esque high-stepping comedic run, and your cat companion repeatedly busts out cat puns. Levels in Monster Hunter World are completely connected open environments, far different from the zones in earlier games which needed to be loaded separately, slowing players down. Considering a key component of the series' gameplay loop is tracking monsters from zone to zone, often mid-boss fight, this now comparatively adds up to minutes of save time for players each mission. This helps to streamline the process of hunts and fill the player's time with more action per minute. In fact, that's what nearly all the changes and improvements made with World do. Monster loot drops now take up their own inventory spaces, unlike other games where they took up item slots. Nearly any action can be rolled out of, so if a player accidentally, say, picks a berry in the middle of the fight, they're no longer committed to finish that animation. Speaking of picking berries, item gathering is now much faster than other games and can be achieved while running. Any item can be set from a pause menu to be auto-crafted when the required materials are gathered. Levels now contain multiple camps, which players can visit in the middle of missions to change loadouts and resupply. Pickaxes for mining and whetstones for weapon sharpening are no longer consumable. Players have an infinite supply in the field. Drinking potions no longer requires players to be locked in place. Attacking monsters now displays damage numbers, which numerically show the damage a player is dealing and visually signpost which areas of a monster are weak. Anything that a player has discovered from a material to a monster can be tracked from the map simply by placing a pin on it, which completely does away with earlier entries' paintball shooting mechanics. The new ecological research team in Astera compiles information on every monster in the game, providing detailed profiles on the monster's weaknesses and even the loot they drop when specific parts of them get damaged. Such information used to only be contained in wikis outside the game world, and it's smart for Capcom to make such information insular and keep players in the game as much as possible. Whew, goodness, that was kind of an exhausting list of improvements, but what's most important is that all of them come together to give players a sense of control and liberty that is unprecedented in the series. This is, without a doubt, the most accessible the series has ever been, but none of the improvements are likely to scare off longtime fans. All told, Monster Hunter World is the definitive entry in the series thus far. It is the most comprehensible, most accessible Monster Hunter title, and the one that keeps the player in the game more often than any other. Finally, Monster Hunter has made it to a current generation of consoles in America, and thankfully, nothing was lost in the conversion. I highly recommend it.